After the Prom. The icons of a living culture do not begin as canonical works preserved in books and museums and taught in university classrooms. They begin as treasures of living memory, and when official canonization is not forthcoming, they either fade from that memory or remain and survive there, as Norman Rockwell's After the Prom has remained and survived in mine. I remember its appearance on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post on May 25, 1957, when I was as young as its protagonists. Reconsidering it now, I find myself hard-pressed to come up with a better example of Rockwell's penchant for giving us, as John Updike puts it, a little more than the occasion strictly demands. With After the Prom, Rockwell has given us a great deal more than the occasion demands. A full-fledged, intricately constructed, deeply knowledgeable work that recruits the total resources of European narrative picture-making to tell the tiny tale of agape he has chosen to portray. All this for the cover of a weekly periodical whose pages will curl and melt before we have forgotten Rockwell's image. The post version of After the Prom is a reproduction of a painting done in oil pigments on an easel-size, rectangular canvas that is about 13% taller than it is wide. In the narrative of the painting, Rockwell has positioned us so we are at once inside and outside the story. We have just entered a small drugstore in an American town on a spring evening, and now stand facing a 1930s-era soda fountain bathed in golden light and populated by local citizens in 1950s-era clothing. A soda jerk is on duty behind the counter. In the right center of the picture, a blonde girl in a white formal dress and a brown-haired boy in a white dinner jacket and dark slacks sit facing each other on counter stools so that we see them in profile. The boy perches on his stool in an erect posture, holding the girl's purse and gloves before him, with her pale pink sweater draped across his forearm. He looks on proudly as the soda jerk leans across the counter to inhale the fragrance of the girl's gardenia corsage. She lifts the flowers from her shoulder to present them to him. The third customer at the counter, partially cropped by the left edge of the picture, sits on a stool with his back to us, holding a cup of coffee in his right hand. He glances over and smiles as the soda jerk sniffs the gardenia. A working man and almost certainly a war veteran, he wears a tattered bomber jacket, an Air Force cap with a visor, and khaki pants. The small-town consanguinity of the group is emphasized by the fact that all four figures in the painting bear a vague resemblance to one another. The boy and the soda jerk, who have the same nose, chin, and eyebrows, are almost certainly brothers. Everyone in the picture is smiling the same small smile, and we, as beholders, both inside and outside this cozy scene, are invited to smile as well. We are inside the store, but not up at the counter. Even so, the open picture plane still welcomes us. It implies that even though it is best to be a part of the community, just being a part of the society is not so bad, because even though we cannot smell the gardenia, we can inhale the atmosphere of the benign tableau arranged around it. The clustered burst of white in the center of Rockwell's painting constitutes our gardenia. We stand in the same relationship to that white blossom of tactile paint as the soda jerk does to the girl's corsage. To compose this scene, Rockwell has divided the vertical rectangle of his picture in the traditional European manner by laying the short side of the rectangle off against its long side, creating two overlapping squares whose intersecting diagonals create the picture's armature. The bottom line of the upper square runs along the tile line at the base of the stools. The top line of the lower square runs exactly through the boy's sight line, marking one of the horizon lines in the bent space of the painting. The whole action of the picture occurs within the overlapping area of the two squares, at or just below our eye level. The counter, the kick rail, and the floor tile create a harmonic sequence of strong horizontals that intersect the regular verticals of the stools, the wood paneling, and the signs on the wall behind the counter. This, in turn, creates an architectural grid into which the human figures are arranged in an intricate pattern of rhyming angles. The front edge of the girl's dress, her upper arm, and the soda jerk's extended left forearm all lie on left slanting 45-degree angles. The veteran's lower leg and the boy's upper leg lie on right slanting 45-degree angles that reinforce the right slanting 45-degree sightline of the soda jerk as he gazes at the gardenia. The boy's upper leg intersects the front of the girl's dress at a right angle, just above the horizontal center line of the painting. This creates an inverted triangle that cradles the intimate action of the picture. The upper leg of the veteran and the boy's lower leg lie exactly on a falling 30-degree line that traverses the picture. So their bent legs create two symmetrically opposed 70-degree angles, like arrows, pointing to the girl, who is the center of all their attention. The pencil behind the soda jerk's ear, also on a 30-degree angle, points out the girl as well. In his most elegant formal maneuver, Rockwell takes the right pointing triangle created by the working man's bent leg and the left edge of the canvas and rotates it 90 degrees to the right, so it reappears as the upward pointing triangle created by the soda jerk's bent left arm and the top of the counter. In this way, Rockwell invests the static, symmetrical encounter between the boy and the girl with dynamic balance by shifting its center of gravity about 13% upward and to the right, as indicated by the direction of the pointing triangles, to a point marked by the inverted triangle that cradles the central action. This device, combined with his cropping of the counter on the left and right, creates a picture that, although harmonious and delicately balanced within itself, does not feel self-enclosed or claustrophobic. It still opens out. It still includes us. To achieve this peculiar blend of inclusion and exclusion, Rockwell employs a pictorial strategy invented in late 18th century France and subtly alters it to his own purposes. As Michael Fried points out in Absorption and Theatricality, Painting and Beholder, The Age of Diderot, 1980, one of the idiosyncratic inventions of the period was the practice of inserting a surrogate beholder into narrative pictures, a character whose response to the action we may take as a cue, and through whose eyes we are presumed to see the scene portrayed in its optimum configuration. This device is employed as a naughty joke in Jean-Honoré Fragonard's The Swing, where the surrogate beholder has a revealing view of the young lady in the swing that is not available to us. In Jacques-Louis David's Belisarius Receiving Alms, we see Justinian's great general, unfairly disgraced and blinded by the emperor, reduced to begging in the street. One of Belisarius's soldiers stands in the background facing us, witnessing the scene we see from the opposite side. His horror and alarm cue our own responses, and his presence renders the action of the painting self-enclosed, as if we were seeing this drama from outside the moment and behind the proscenium. In After the Prom, the soda jerk is our surrogate beholder, or inhaler in this case. His response is clearly a cue to our own, but with a difference. 18th century paintings of this sort, such as Jean-Baptiste Siméon Chardin's House of Cards or Fragonard's Young Woman Reading, insist on the privacy of the experience, of a young man building his house of cards, or a young woman engrossed in her romantic novel. By extension, the private experience of absorbed beholder inside the painting is presumed to be analogous to that of the absorbed beholder outside the painting. Both are presumed to be engaged in internal activities outside the realm of the social. And After the Prom, however, the soda jerk is not alone. He is himself beheld by the three other figures in the painting. He inhales the fragrance of the gardenia, that is symbolic of young love, and he visibly responds. The other figures in the painting respond to his responses, and to one another. We respond to the totality of these responses, but we are not alone either. We are joined by the many citizens glancing at their weekly issue of the Saturday Evening Post. The innocent relationship between the two young people, then, is less the subject of than the occasion for Rockwell's picture. The generosity of the characters' responses, and of our own, is the painting's true argumentative moral subject. And this was especially true in 1957, when Rockwell's prescient visual argument that the kids are all right was far from de rigueur. Having been a kid in 1957, I can testify to the welcome reassurance of Rockwell's benediction. It was exactly what was needed because, even though we all remember that America's children rebelled against their parents in the 1960s, we tend to forget that American parents rebelled against their own children in the 1950s. That in the midst of the post-war boom, They began to regard their offspring as spoiled, hedonistic delinquents who had not fought World War II or suffered through the Great Depression and were now reaping the unearned benefits of their parents' struggle. This attitude is the target of the reproach implied by the veteran's response. His benign smile seems to say, "This is what I was fighting for. This is the true consequence of that great historical cataclysm, this moment with the kids and the gardenia corsage." Rockwell's picture, then, opposes the comfortable, suspicious pessimism of the 1950s and proposes, in its place, a tolerance for and faith in the young as the ground-level condition of democracy. And, strangely enough, this is probably the single aspect of Rockwell's work that distinguishes him as a peculiarly American artist. In all other aspects, Rockwell was a profoundly European painter of the bourgeois social world, in an American tradition that has almost no social painters and very few paintings that portray groups of people at all, except at ceremonial occasions in faux democratic history paintings or as figures in a landscape. Rockwell painted mercantile society in the tradition of Franz Hals, William Hogarth, Jean-Baptiste Greuze, Louis-Léopold Boilly, and William Frith. But as an American, he painted a society grounded not in the wisdom of its elders, but in the promise of its youth. This, I think, accounts for the perfect inversion of European convention in After the Prom. Rockwell was not painting a bucolic genre idol like one of François Boucher's romantic encounters of shepherd and shepherdess. He was investing this small-town flirtation with the seriousness of historical romance. In a comparable European painting by Nicolas Poussin or Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, however, we would see earthbound adult lovers surrounded and celebrated by floating infants. In Rockwell's painting, we have floating youths surrounded and celebrated by earthbound adults. Thus, the two adults in After the Prom are invested with considerable weight. The soda jerk leans theatrically on the counter. The veteran sits heavily on his stool, leans against the counter, and rests his foot on the rail. The force of gravity is made further visible by the draped sweater on the boy's arm and the hanging keys on the veteran's belt, while the two young people, in their whiteness and brightness, float above the floor, in one of the most complex achieved emblems of agape, tolerance, and youthful promise ever painted. Even as After the Prom was being painted, however, the Saturday Evening Post was in the midst of phasing out the kinds of paintings that Norman Rockwell had created for its covers since 1916. These covers were justifiably famous and much beloved, but the times were a-changin', and in the rush of things, Rockwell's vignettes of everyday life quickly succumbed to the rising vogue for celebrity icons among American media providers. As a consequence, the last great poet of American childhood, the Jan Vermeer of this nation's domestic history, concluded his career as a glorified paparazzo. For more than 40 years, Rockwell beguiled American citizens with generous and felicitous representations of themselves. He ended up painting pseudo-heroic portraits of their public surrogates and illustrating moral platitudes. Of the first 310 covers Rockwell painted for the Saturday Evening Post between May 1916 and September 1960, 306 portray ordinary Americans. Only 4 portray celebrities: Dwight Eisenhower twice, Adlai Stevenson, and Bob Hope. Of the last 12 covers he painted between October 1960 and December 1963, 7 portray celebrities, 3 of which are paintings of John F. Kennedy. Included among Rockwell's last non-celebrity covers is one of those egregious moralizing Victorian tableaux, April 1, 1961, of the sort once commissioned from the painter Lord Frederick Leighton. The world's peoples attired in ethnic regalia, across whom text implores us to do unto others as he would have them do unto you. Yet Norman Rockwell remains a sustaining presence in the public consciousness, a more important artist than his modernist and postmodernist detractors will ever acknowledge, and a more complex artist than his traditionalist defenders are likely to admit. His pictures were loved and respected, not only by the American public, but by artistic spirits as dissimilar as Willem de Kooning and Andy Warhol. During the 40 years since the zenith of Rockwell's career, the commercial illustrators with whom he competed for jobs have become historical footnotes. as have 99% of the modern artists whose work was presumed to be infinitely superior to his, as in fact has modernism itself. During Rockwell's public vogue, popular narratives in all media were routinely compared to his way of looking at the world, and even today the vast preponderance of these narratives begin by evoking some version of his domestic universe, then place that cosmos in jeopardy through the machinations of criminals, bureaucrats, aliens, or asteroids. All of this suggests that the American vision Norman Rockwell invented and refined, which was supplanted by the rise of celebrity culture in the 1960s, was that which was new. In the history of art, Rockwell was the last, best practitioner of a tradition of social painting that began in the 17th century. In the history of America's democracy and popular culture, he was the first, and maybe the last, visual artist who aspired to charm us all, and for nearly half a century, he managed to do it. Viewed from this perspective, the last anecdotal vignette Rockwell painted for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, November 3, 1962, seems ominously prophetic. In this painting, Lunch Break with a Knight, the night guard of the Higgins Armory Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts, sits in semi-darkness on the edge of a pedestal upon which a knight in full armor, astride his festooned and armored charger, presents a lance that disappears out of the top of the picture, so both horse and rider seem suspended from it, as if on a merry-go-round. The museum guard is tucked into the lower right corner of the picture, the least dominant position in the rectangle. We hardly notice him at first, and when we do, it's clear that the little guy is tired and a bit bored. He sits there with an open napkin on his lap and pours himself a cup of coffee from his thermos. He seems prepared to wait out a long and tedious night amid his gleaming, posturing, heroic charges. At that moment, in the early 1960s, so were we all. The painting of the Night Guard marks the end of what I consider to be the real, or at least the important, Norman Rockwell. The picture seems to be telling us that, and perhaps Rockwell knew it himself. Or perhaps he didn't. In any case, he eagerly participated in his own sanctification, or maturation, as he would have called it. Having never had a proper American childhood, Rockwell had always been, in his own perception, a child at heart and an instinctive outsider. During this period, as Rockwell underwent psychotherapy, he stopped thinking of himself as a big kid making pictures to make friends, and started thinking of himself as a mature artist, as an authority on kids, like his two friends Eric Erikson and Robert Coles. Psychotherapist Eric Erikson, a former student of Anna Freud's, was one of Boston's first child analysts and the author of Childhood and Society, 1950, the book that introduced the term identity crisis into the lexicon of American childhood. Robert Coles's book Children of Crisis, 1967, dealt with the effects of the civil rights movement on children in the South, and his story of Ruby Bridges may have provided the inspiration for the young black girl walking to her newly integrated school in New Orleans, escorted by federal marshals in Rockwell's The Problem We All Live With, 1964. As strong and accomplished as this picture is, however, its cool Davidian remoteness marks the end of Rockwell's instinctive identification with the citizens he painted and the beginning of his tenure as a member of the nation's new therapeutic power elite. Rockwell would never gain any real access to Erikson's and Coles's peculiarly psychologized and Germanic vision of culture and childhood, but from this time forward, he would routinely mistake his friend's vocation for his own. He would generalize from particulars in the manner of a social scientist, rather than particularizing generalities as he had always done. Henceforth, like a painter king, he would paint his subjects rather than other citizens of the Republic. He would illustrate issues rather than portraying other children of folly like himself. In his notes for a 1966 speech, although not in the lecture itself, Rockwell explains this shift. He begins by announcing, "There was a change in the thought climate in America, brought on by scientific advances, the atom bomb, 2 world wars, Mr. Freud, and psychology." In conclusion, he responds optimistically to this daunting roll call by declaring himself to be wildly excited about painting contemporary subjects, Pictures about civil rights, astronauts, poverty programs. It's wonderful. Today, it's clear that these remarks mark a turn for the worse in Rockwell's career, but it would be a mistake to blame it all on science, psychotherapy, and Kennedy-esque rhetoric. The truth is that even though Rockwell was one of the great visual narrators of the 20th century, he always thought of himself as an illustrator, and finally he became one. Throughout his career, he was always casting about for the big picture, for the great subject that would establish him as the important artist he correctly believed himself to be. In the end, sadly, he found the one and lost the other. His big pictures herald the twilight of his artistic importance. In his fatal misapprehension of his gifts, however, Rockwell was far from alone among American artists and writers. He was, in fact, no more the self-deluded Victorian than Mark Twain, who was similarly incapable of crediting his own, in Twain's case, comedic gifts, who thought Huckleberry Finn paled in its achievement beside his Joan of Arc, a novel that, in its platitudinous tedium, may be justly compared to Rockwell's Four Freedoms, 1943. None of this diminishes either Twain's or Rockwell's startling achievements, however. And even though Rockwell himself concurred with the then-fashionable assumption that his old-hat domestic manner had somehow been superseded by the new glamour of issue-oriented celebrity journalism, that does not make it so, since nothing in Western culture is older than that. Homer invented celebrity journalism in the Iliad, and its return in the early 1960s, courtesy one suspects of wily Joe Kennedy and his tame Harvardiers, signified nothing more than the last vulgar recrudescence of the great man theory of history, the dying swoon of an elitist idea that the virtue of a society resides in the concerns and personae of its leaders and heroes, rather than in those of its citizens. In the history of Western art, this idea expresses itself in the traditional distinction between history painting and genre painting. Genre painting concerns itself with low subjects, everyday people whose ordinary, inconsequent activities, eating, gambling, smoking, reading, singing, playing the lute, are portrayed as evidence of human vanitas, as testaments to the perpetual evanescence of earthly desires. History painting, on the other hand, concerns itself with kings, heroes, gods, and saints and their consequent, which is to say historical, activities. Norman Rockwell's great achievement was introducing this distinction and investing the daily activities of ordinary people with a sense of historical consequence. This, I think, best explains Rockwell's survival as an artist. Put simply, Norman Rockwell invented democratic history painting, an artistic practice based on an informing vision of history conceived of and portrayed as the cumulative actions of millions of ordinary human beings, living in historical time, growing up and growing old. George Caleb Bingham is Rockwell's only American predecessor in this field, and his paintings are less historical narratives than provincial reportage, their emphasis falling more heavily on the place than on the times. Benjamin West's democratized history paintings simply substitute elected officials for crowned heads in the same pictorial universe. Rockwell's best pictures, conversely, treat each quotidian moment as a distinct historical occasion. Moreover, Rockwell presumed that this moment would remain available to us in the continuity of tumultuous micro-histories that define democracy in progress. It is exactly this sense of history as tumult, however, that makes Rockwell a very poor candidate for the position of conservative icon for which he is regularly nominated. He does indeed portray a simpler past in loving detail, but this devotional aura derives less from his reactionary tendencies than from the fact that he invariably portrayed the present as a historical moment, as if it were the past, or moving rapidly in that direction. For Rockwell, the world was ruthlessly tumbling forward, so he passionately captured the moment as it faded. Antique manners and traditional values, however, were never his true subject. His most popular postcover, Saying Grace, 1951, which depicts a grandmother and her grandson praying before a meal in a crowded downtown restaurant, is routinely cited as evidence of his commitment to family values. It is presumed to be a celebration of familial obedience, adherence to established religion, and respect for tradition. In fact, as Rockwell himself insisted, saying grace no more advocates public prayer than After the Prom advocates teen dating. Its subject is the crowd of secular onlookers, our surrogate beholders, who respectfully tolerate citizens with values different from their own. Their behavior is being celebrated because in a democracy where everyone is different and anything can happen, tolerance is the overriding social virtue. Thus, those who look for traditional values in Norman Rockwell pictures will discover a virtual cornucopia of difference and disobedience. Neither a scientific naturalist nor a conservative realist, Rockwell portrayed a world in which the minimum conditions of democracy are made visible. His best paintings insist that the atmosphere of benign tolerance, each tiny occasion of kindness, comedy, anxiety, and tristesse, far from being evidence of human vanity, is a critical element in the fate of the Republic. The characters in Rockwell's pictures may be types, then, but they are alive in time, never trapped in their particular historical instant, but living through that moment on a specific historical trajectory. The kids in Norman Rockwell's America always grow up. They are growing up before our eyes, in fact, and in Rockwell's pictures they always grow up free. In 1956, on a calendar, Rockwell reprised his famous No Swimming cover from 1921. He painted the same kids 35 years later, fully grown, but breaking the same rules with a new dog. That is the message. Democracy progresses in an untidy dance of disobedience and tolerance. So today I like to imagine the kids in Rockwell's pictures growing up as the kids who grew up looking at his pictures grew up. I imagine the kid with his bindle sitting at the soda fountain with the nice cop in The Runaway, 1958, 10 years later. He is standing by a highway with his backpack, thumbing a ride to San Francisco. Or he is bleeding and battered on the streets of Chicago, having encountered an altogether different sort of policeman. I imagine the girl with black eye, 1953, who sits grinning outside the principal's office a decade later, burning her bra. I imagine the kids in After the Prom sitting around the campfire in some commune in New Mexico, trying to recapture the golden glow of that night at the soda fountain. I do this because these things actually happened, and more, because Jack Kerouac took Norman Rockwell on the road to portray a big, flat, magical America full of kindness, comedy, and tristesse. Because Hugh Hefner took the grown-up kids from Rockwell's pictures into the bedroom and invented a new American iconography of girl-next-door domestic eros. Because all these kids showed up at Woodstock in search of that peculiar Rockwellian blend of tolerance and disobedience. They stood out there in the mud and waited for Roger Daltrey to sing their anthem. The kids are all right. They probably still are.